If anything happens to me, I will have left a full account of this conversation with 3 separate people.
The widow was sold to settle her husband's debts, but the buyer was the Duke she dreaded the most. The auctioneer's voice carried down the street like something indecent. Courtney Crawford stood on the pavement outside her own home and watched strangers carry her life out through the front door. The mahogany writing desk her mother had left her. The set of botanical prints she had collected across 7 years of careful saving. A silver hairbrush that had no monetary value whatsoever and was being held up to the October light by a man with ink-stained fingers who did not understand what he was holding. She did not cry. She had learned, in the 14 months since Henry Crawford's death, that tears accomplished nothing a straight spine could not accomplish better. But her hands, folded against her black skirts, were trembling. This was the 3rd auction in 6 weeks. The creditors had taken the carriage first, then the silver, then the contents of the dining room. Now they had come for everything else. Everything she had managed to hold on to through sheer stubbornness and the vague, increasingly desperate belief that some solution existed that she had not yet thought of. She had run out of solutions. Tomorrow morning, she was required to present herself at the offices of Bartholomew Crane, solicitor and primary creditor, to discuss what he called the final arrangement. She did not know what the final arrangement was. She was about to find out. Before we go further, if you have ever watched someone lose everything and refuse to look away, this story is for you. Subscribe now. Stay with Courtney, because what waits for her at the end of this road is nothing like what she expects. And neither is the man. The office on Aldgate Street smelled of mildew and finished lives. Mr. Crane occupied his desk the way certain men occupy rooms, as if the furniture had been commissioned specifically to make other people feel small. Thin and very still, with eyes the color of February skies. When Courtney entered, he did not stand. He gestured to the chair across from him with the efficiency of someone who had performed this gesture many times and intended to perform it many more. Mrs. Crawford. Not a greeting, a notation. Mr. Crane. She sat. She kept her hands in her lap where he could not see them. He opened a folder without preamble and turned it to face her. The numbers were catastrophic. She had known they were bad. She had not known they were this bad. Henry had been busy in their years of marriage, accumulating debts in the careful, systematic way of a man who believed the future would somehow sort itself out. Gambling losses, failed ventures, loans taken against properties he did not own. The total was a sum so large it ceased to feel like money and became instead something abstract and crushing, like weather. There is no payment plan that satisfies the creditors, Crane said as though she had asked. She had not. Your late husband was remarkably thorough in his recklessness. Courtney kept her voice even. Then what do you propose? Something shifted in Crane's expression. Not quite a smile, but its shadow. The look of a man who has been waiting for a specific question. A transfer contract. Your legal person, your labor, your residence, your status is assumed by an identified buyer. The debts transfer with you. You are released from all financial obligation. Released. The words sat between them like something with teeth. Who is the buyer? Crane paused. That pause, brief, deliberate, loaded, told her he had been enjoying this moment since before she walked through the door. Duke Louie Pritchard of Thornvick. The room tilted. She knew the name. Everyone in London knew the name. But she also knew what followed it in whispered conversation. The particular quality of rumors that accumulate around a man when something has gone very wrong and no one has been given a satisfactory explanation. His wife had died, 3 years of marriage and then gone. A carriage accident on the Yorkshire moors, the official account said. But carriage accidents did not make servants leave without notice. Carriage accidents did not make a man seal half his estate and refuse all visitors for 6 years running. And there was the other detail, spoken even more quietly than the rest. His daughter had been in that carriage too, a child of 2. Both of them gone on the same night. He had been a widower at 32. He was 38 now, and by all accounts had not permitted anyone close enough to matter since. She had seen him once, 3 years ago at a charity reception in Mayfair. She had been crossing the ballroom when she became aware of being watched. She had turned, and his eyes had found hers. For a few minutes of conversation across a room full of people, she had felt, for the first and only time in her life, genuinely perceived, not appraised, seen. It had unsettled her so completely, she had spent the intervening years ensuring their paths never crossed again. Now he would own her. Crane produced the transfer contract. Her name was already inscribed in the designated spaces in ink that was still faintly wet. He had written it before she arrived, before she could refuse, before the word choice had any meaning at all. Courtney picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake. The signature emerged steady and clear, each letter a small act of surrender performed with as much dignity as surrender permitted. She set down the pen and looked at Crane directly. "If anything happens to me," she said, "I will have left a full account of this conversation with 3 separate people." It was a bluff. She had no one left to leave accounts with. But Crane's eyes flickered, just slightly, and that flicker was the only victory available to her. She took it and walked out. On her way through the outer office, the young clerk at the front desk glanced toward Crane's closed door and lowered his voice. "The Duke of Thornvick, Mrs. Crawford." A pause. Honorable man by all accounts. Never cruel to anyone as far as anyone knows. Another pause, shorter. But his wife and the little girl, some say it was an accident. Some say he was the only one there when it happened. She walked out into the October cold carrying 2 pieces of information that refused to sit comfortably beside each other. An honorable man. The only one there when it happened. She had 3 days before the carriage came for her. She spent them trying to decide which version of Louie Pritchard was the true one. She did not sleep much. Like this video, if Courtney's courage already means something to you, subscribe, because the man she is about to meet is not what anyone expects, including her. The estate emerged from the Yorkshire moorland the way certain truths emerge, not gradually but all at once, with a completeness that made it impossible to imagine not knowing. Gray stone against a grayer sky. Towers that rose not with grandeur, but with the particular authority of things that have outlasted everything around them. Windows narrow as accusations. The walls seemed to absorb the failing afternoon light rather than reflect it, as if Thornvick had been constructed specifically to take things in and give nothing back. Courtney pressed her palm against the cold carriage window and told herself she was not afraid. She was afraid. The interior swallowed her immediately. Persian rugs in burgundy and charcoal silenced her footsteps. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the entrance hall, generations of Pritchards who had occupied this land and left their certainty preserved in oil paint. The air carried beeswax and aged leather, and beneath both of those things, something she could not name, a scent like grief that had been left so long it had become structural, embedded in the walls themselves. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 50 with a face that had been trained carefully out of expression. She led Courtney through corridors without speaking. At the top of the grand staircase, Courtney paused. On the wall of the first landing, where a portrait clearly belonged, the hook was there, the unfaded rectangle of wallpaper was there, hung instead a square of black cloth, pinned at each corner, covering whatever image lay beneath it completely. "Who is that?" Courtney asked. Mrs. Pemberton did not turn around. "This way, Mrs. Crawford." Courtney looked at the covered portrait a moment longer. The cloth was not dusty. It had been recently replaced or regularly maintained. Someone tended it. She filed the question away and followed. The library doors opened and he was standing before an unlit fireplace with his back to the room, taller than she remembered from that brief encounter 3 years ago, dressed in dark gray that absorbed the lamplight rather than catching it. When he turned at the sound of her arrival, the first thing she registered was his eyes, dark and carrying the precise, focused quality of attention she remembered and had spent years trying not to think about. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for and is not entirely certain he deserves. "Mrs. Crawford, Your Grace." She held his gaze. She would not be the first to look away. Something moved across his expression, there and gone before she could name it. "You understand the terms of the arrangement." "I do." "You will have adequate accommodations and freedom within the property. I do not expect subservience, only that we occupy the same space without causing each other unnecessary difficulty." A measured pause. "I am not given to cruelty." "I have heard that about you," Courtney said. "I have heard other things as well." The silence that followed was absolute. She watched for guilt, for anger, for the flinch of a man who had something to hide. What she found instead was something that looked almost like recognition. "I imagine you have," he said quietly, "and nothing more." He turned back to the fireplace, dismissing her with the finality of a door being closed from the inside. Mrs. Pemberton materialized and led her away. Her room was beautiful with the careful beauty of a space prepared by someone who understood comfort without feeling it personally. Rosewood furniture, emerald velvet curtains, a 4-poster bed dressed in hand-embroidered quilts. She crossed to the window. The gardens below were frozen in October stillness, geometric, ordered, completely motionless. The whole estate felt suspended, as if it had stopped at a precise moment and been unable to move forward since. On the wall above the fireplace, she noticed a small hook at eye level. The wallpaper behind it was unfaded. Something had hung here recently and been removed before she arrived. Someone had cleared this room of images. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to Thornvick settle around her in the dark. There were things being hidden from her in this house. The question was whether they were being hidden out of cruelty or out of grief so deep it had nowhere left to go. She did not yet know the answer. She intended to find it. She is in his house. He is watching her. She is watching him. And on that staircase landing, behind a square of black cloth, is the face of a woman whose story will change everything Courtney thinks she understands about the man she fears. Stay with us. The first week moved in silence and careful observation. Dinners at opposite ends of a table built for 20, inhabited by 2. Louie ate with focused efficiency, his attention on his plate with the concentration of a man performing a necessary function. When his eyes lifted, they settled on her for exactly 1 measured moment before returning. Not rudely, but with a deliberateness that suggested he was calculating something he had not yet finished calculating. The afternoons were hers. She mapped the estate methodically. The library was a cathedral of accumulated knowledge, first editions pressed against ancient manuscripts in an order that suggested genuine use. She could have spent a month in it without touching the same book twice. She moved through the stacks slowly, trailing her fingers across spines, pulling volumes at random, breathing in pages the way someone breathes in air after a long time underground. The music room was locked. She tried the handle twice at different hours and found it resistant both times. Through the keyhole, she could see only darkness and the edge of something large beneath white cloth. The conservatory thrived with aggressive vitality, orchids in violent color, ferns unfurling with the stubbornness of things that refused to participate in the surrounding stillness. Someone tended this space with genuine devotion, but she never saw who. She would arrive to find fresh soil turned, new growth carefully pinched, evidence of care without a visible caretaker. And there was the locked door at the end of the east corridor. Plain oak, iron handle. A keyhole that had been recently oiled. She could smell it. When she asked Mrs. Pemberton what lay behind it, the housekeeper's face performed the same controlled closing it had performed on the stairs. "Storage," Mrs. Pemberton said. "What kind of storage?" "Estate storage, Mrs. Crawford." People did not oil the locks of storage rooms. People did not maintain storage rooms with the same quiet regularity with which someone maintained that locked door. Courtney walked away and said nothing more, but she remembered. By the second week, she had mapped Louie's patterns with the accuracy of close observation. Dawn ride, 1 hour precisely. Bath, solitary breakfast. Mornings in the office, lamplight under the door until midday. Afternoons that varied. The property, the library, occasional 2-hour absences she could not account for. Dinner at 7. And then, the detail that interested her most, at exactly 11 each evening, she heard his footsteps pass her door. Not toward his chambers, the other direction, down the corridor and somewhere beyond it. 1 hour later, every night, the footsteps returned. Where did he go? On the 7th evening at dinner, they had been discussing the estate's farming arrangements when Louie set down his fork and looked at her with the full weight of that attention she found so difficult to meet. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone defeated." He picked up his fork again. "The women Crane brings to these arrangements are usually defeated before they arrive. And you are not." The word arrangements landed like a stone in still water. Women, plural. Crane had done this before. She was not the first woman to sit in that office with her name already inscribed on a document she had not agreed to sign. "Did you know he had done this before?" she asked carefully. Louie was quiet for a moment. "I suspected. I did not have proof." He met her eyes steadily. "That is not a satisfying answer. I am aware." "No," she agreed. "It is not." The conversation ended there. But something had changed in the quality of the silence between them. It was no longer the silence of two strangers performing coexistence. It was the silence of two people who had begun, cautiously, to take each other seriously. She lay awake that night and thought about a man who suspected something was wrong and had not stopped it, and tried to decide whether that made him complicit or simply human. She had not decided by morning. "Do you trust him yet?" Courtney doesn't. Not entirely. Subscribe. Because what is coming in the next act will make the question far more complicated and far more important. It did not happen all at once. That was the thing about it. The thing she would understand only looking back. It happened the way dawn happens, so gradually that you cannot identify the precise moment darkness became light. Only that at some point the world was different, and you could see things you could not see before. It began with books. She had been reading in the library one afternoon. A first edition of Cowper's poetry she had found tucked behind a volume of agricultural law, when Louie entered and stopped at the sight of what she was holding. "You found that," he said. Not a question. Something warmer than a question. "It was hiding," she said. "Someone shelved it incorrectly. Cowper does not belong behind agricultural law." "No," he agreed. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the fire, not across the room from her, beside the fire, which placed him perhaps 6 feet away, the closest he had voluntarily positioned himself since she arrived. Where does he belong? Between the other romantics, and in front of them, not behind. She looked up from the page. "Do you read him?" "I used to." A pause. "I have not read much of anything in some years." The words stopped reaching me. She looked at him for a moment. "That is the most honest thing you have said to me since I arrived." He appeared briefly startled. Then something in his face settled, as if a tension he had been maintaining had been quietly released. "I suppose it is." She returned to the poem. He did not leave. After a while, without asking, she began to read aloud. He sat by the fire and listened, and said nothing, and she understood that silence as something other than indifference. That was the first evening. The second thing was the garden. She had begun restoring the herb garden behind the conservatory, on her knees in the cold earth, working beds that had been neglected into something that might, with patience, become useful again. On the third afternoon, she looked up and found Louie standing at a distance, watching her with his hands clasped behind his back, and an expression she had not seen on him before. Not assessment, something softer than assessment, something almost bewildered. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know." She pushed her trowel into the soil. "I want to. Things that grow need tending. It is straightforward work. I find it steadying." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked over and crouched beside her, without ceremony, without apparent concern for his coat, and began turning soil alongside her with his bare hands. She did not comment on it. Neither did he. They worked in silence for an hour. Rosemary, thyme, sage, each plant set into the ground with the same care you give anything you intend to keep alive. When the light failed, they stood together and looked at what they had done. "I had forgotten," he said, "what it felt like to make something." She looked at his hands, soil under his fingernails, on the cuffs of his coat. A Duke of 38 with earth on his hands, looking at a herb garden with the expression of a man who has just remembered something important. "Then we will have to keep making things," she said. He looked at her when she said it, just for a moment. Then he nodded once and went inside. But he came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. The third thing was the way he listened. At dinner, over the weeks, the table contracted by degrees, not by announcement, simply by the drift of two people who had stopped performing distance. One evening she spoke about the mechanics of botanical healing, about her grandmother who had kept a still room and taught her every preparation in it, about the particular satisfaction of knowing that the plants in the conservatory were not merely decorative but useful. He asked questions. Not polite questions, the kind that fill silence and require no real answer, but the kind that meant he had heard the previous answer and wanted to know more. What was the difference between a preparation for fever and one for pain? How did one learn to read a plant's maturity by its leaves? Had she ever made a mistake that cost someone? That last question surprised her. She answered it honestly. Yes. Once, early, a preparation too strong for the patient. Her grandmother had corrected her without cruelty and made her understand that attentiveness was not optional. "She sounds formidable," Louie said. "She was the most capable person I have ever known," Courtney said. "She was also completely ungovernable. No one could tell her anything she had not already decided to know." His mouth curved, just slightly, but she caught it. "You resemble her," he said. "In the best way, I hope." "In every way," he said, and returned to his dinner as though he had not just said something that sent warmth moving through her chest in a way she was entirely unprepared for. She was careful with it. She was careful because she understood the situation clearly. She was here by contract. He was a man who had been closed for 6 years, and warmth was not the same thing as safety. She did not mistake dinners for declarations. She did not mistake the garden for a courtship. But she noticed. She noticed when he arrived at dinner before she did, which he had not done in the first week. She noticed when he left a book on the library table open to a page he thought she might want to read. She noticed when he began taking his afternoon correspondence in the room adjacent to wherever she was, rather than sealed in his office. She noticed, and she kept her own counsel, and she waited to see what it meant. Two widows, learning each other slowly, one carrying a secret she does not yet know she carries, the other carrying one she's been keeping for 6 years. And somewhere in this house, behind a locked door at the end of a corridor, is the truth that will change everything between them. We are almost there. The storm came in the 3rd week without warning. Courtney woke at 2 a.m. to whine that sounded like something in pain and rain striking the windows with the force of accusation. Lightning split the sky, and in those brief, violent illuminations, she saw the gardens she had spent weeks restoring reduced to chaos. The herb beds flattened, the paths turned to rivers, everything she had coaxed back to life laid flat in the dark. At breakfast, Louie was wrong in a way she had learned to read, the flush beneath his pallor, the hands around his teacup not quite steady, the untouched food. "Are you well?" she asked. "Perfectly," he said, and left the room with fractionally less than his usual precision. By midday, she could hear, from somewhere along the corridor, the sound of something falling. By evening, when he did not come to dinner, she knew. She stood outside his chamber door for a long time, her hand raised to knock, not raised. She had reasons to stay in her room, good reasons, sensible reasons, the kinds of reasons that protected a woman in an uncertain situation from making it more uncertain. He was not her husband. He was not her responsibility. She did not know him well enough to be certain of what she was walking into. She knocked. Nothing. She tried the handle. The room was chaos. Not comfortable disorder. Genuine chaos. The kind that happens when a body stops cooperating with a mind that has spent years controlling everything. Clothes abandoned. A glass shattered on the floor. Books pulled from somewhere and left open at no particular page. In the 4-poster bed, his figure twisted in sheets drenched through with sweat. His skin burned when she pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. She stood there for one more moment. Then she went to find willow bark. Through the hours until dawn, she did not leave his side. Cold compresses applied and reapplied with patience. Bitter infusions coaxed between his lips. His pulse counted against her fingers, monitored, counted again. This was her grandmother's gift, not the preparations themselves, but the willingness to stay, to watch, to refuse to look away. And through all of it, the fever spoke. It came in fragments, barely coherent, wrenched up from somewhere beneath the careful architecture of his daily self. "Eleanor, I cannot. The road. Please. Eleanor, please. Rose. Where is Rose? Someone find Rose. Eleanor. Rose. His wife. His daughter." She sat beside him in the dark and listened to names she had not known until this moment, spoken with a raw devastation that the waking Louie Pritchard would never have permitted anyone to witness. This was what lived beneath the counted hours and the locked doors and the 11 o'clock footsteps and the covered portrait on the stairs. This was what 6 years of rigid control had been built to contain. And then, in a quieter moment, when his breathing had steadied slightly and the worst of the fever seemed to pause, he spoke her name. Courtney. Not Mrs. Crawford, not the widow. Her name. Spoken in the dark by a man who did not know she could hear him, with a weight that had nothing performed about it. She sat very still. She told herself it meant nothing. A fevered man speaks names. A fevered man reaches for whatever is present. But she stayed closer than she needed to. And when dawn finally broke gray and cold through the curtains and his breathing had deepened into genuine sleep, she was still there. On the nightstand, she noticed a small iron key on a plain ring. She looked at it for a long moment. She knew which lock it fit. She left it where it was and walked out, closing the door behind her with quiet care. Not yet. He said her name. In the dark. When no one was performing anything for anyone. Remember that. Subscribe. Because what she discovers next will reshape everything she thought she understood about this man and his grief. He woke to late morning light and found her asleep in the chair beside his bed. She had not gone back to her room. The damp linens on the floor, the empty glass with its residue of bitter medicine, the lamp burned cold. All of it told the story of a night she had not been required to stay for and had stayed for anyway. The mattress betrayed him when he shifted. Her eyes opened immediately, moving through disorientation to recognition. "You are better," she said. Her voice was rough with exhaustion. "Because of you." The words left before he could reconsider them. She looked briefly startled, as though gratitude were a language she had stopped expecting from him. "I did what was needed. You did considerably more than that." The silence between them was different now. Those early silences had been empty. This one had weight. Something had shifted in the night, and neither of them had the language for it yet. She rose and gathered linens with efficient movements, as if physical occupation could make the electricity in the room less apparent. "Mrs. Crawford." She paused at the door without turning fully. "Thank you." 2 words that sounded from him, as if they had been excavated from somewhere very deep and brought up into the light at considerable cost. She nodded once and left. The days that followed were different in the specific way that days are different after 2 people have been alone together in the dark and cannot unknow it. The dinner table continued to contract. Conversations that had once lasted the minimum required time now stretched past the candles burning low. She spoke about botanical science, about her grandmother, about the poets she had loved before marriage narrowed her world. He listened, not with the polite distraction of someone waiting for a pause, but with the undivided attention of someone who had spent years in his own head and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred this. One afternoon, the weather turned mild. He found her at the edge of the moorland with her face turned toward the thin autumn sun and offered his arm without speaking. They walked together across the open landscape for an hour. He pointed out small things, wildflowers forcing themselves through rocky soil, a hawk turning slow circles over a distant ridge, the way the light changed the color of the stone every quarter mile. "I forgot about these," he said quietly. "What brought you back?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "You did." He said it in the tone of a man reporting an observable fact, which somehow made it harder to dismiss than any declaration would have been. When he reached for her hand, she did not pull away. His fingers around hers were careful, deliberate, the gesture of a man who had been keeping his hands to himself for a very long time and was making a considered exception. They walked back to Thornvick in the failing light, and neither spoke of it. But she noticed that in the days following he arrived at dinner before she did, that he left books open on the library table to pages he thought she might want, that he had stopped taking his correspondence sealed in his office and had begun working in the room adjacent to wherever she was. She noticed. She kept her own counsel, and she waited. At a neighboring county ball, he introduced her to society and moved through the room with her beside him while the whispers accumulated. When Lord Pemberton made a cutting remark about her family's financial history, Louie's voice dropped to something very quiet. "I would choose your next words with considerable care," he said, "or you will find every drawing room in England inconveniently unavailable to you." Pemberton found somewhere else to be. On the carriage ride home, she looked at him in the darkness. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said simply. And that was the end of it. She looked out at the dark moorland passing and thought, this is what it feels like to be defended. She had not known, before this moment, that she had never experienced it. She used the key on a Tuesday afternoon when the rain had returned, and Louie was deep in correspondence. She had carried it in her pocket for 3 days after returning it to his nightstand, then taking it again, telling herself she would decide later. The decision made itself on a Tuesday afternoon, when she could no longer bear not knowing. The lock turned without resistance. The room beyond was a child's bedroom, not abandoned, preserved, every surface clean, every object in its precise place, with the specific stillness of a room that is regularly tended rather than simply untouched. A small bed with a white coverlet, a shelf of picture books ordered carefully by height, a rocking horse in the corner with a ribbon around its neck that had faded from crimson to pale pink. On the windowsill, a collection of small stones, the kind a child gathers on walks and brings home as treasures, not yet knowing that their value exists only to her. On the bedside table, a small framed portrait. A woman, dark-haired, composed, with a quality of stillness in her face that Courtney recognized because she had seen it in the man downstairs. Beside her, a child of perhaps 3 years, her father's eyes in a laughing face, caught in the act of reaching for something outside the frame. Eleanor, Rose. Below the portrait, in Louie's handwriting, their names, and below them, 2 dates separated by a single terrible night in February 6 years ago. Courtney stood in the doorway of that small room and understood, with a completeness that arrived all at once, what she was looking at. Not just a wife and daughter lost, a whole world. A laughing child and the woman who had loved her, gone on the same night, and the man left in the wreckage of it, locking the door and oiling the hinge and climbing the stairs at 11 every evening for 6 years, because grief, when it has nowhere to go, keeps its own appointments. She understood the covered portrait. She understood the hook on her bedroom wall where a picture had been removed before she arrived, because he had not wanted her to see his wife's face until he was ready for her to see it. She understood the conservatory and its impossible vitality, the one room in the house where things were allowed to live and grow, tended by the same hands that tended this room. She replaced the key carefully and left everything exactly as she had found it. She did not tell him she had been inside, but that evening at dinner, when the conversation paused in one of its comfortable silences, she said quietly, "Eleanor was beautiful." He went very still. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had preceded it. She watched his face move through something, surprise, exposure, the particular vulnerability of a man who has been seen in a place he did not know anyone could reach. "You went in," he said. "Yes." She did not apologize. "The key was on your nightstand. I think perhaps you left it there on purpose." A long pause. "Perhaps," he said. "Rose had your eyes," Courtney said. Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, quietly, the way things break that have been held together for a very long time. He set down his fork and was silent for a moment, and she waited, and did not fill the silence, because some silences need to be honored rather than resolved. "She did," he said finally. "She had Eleanor's laugh, but my eyes. She used to—" He stopped, started again. "She used to collect stones from the garden path and bring them to me one at a time, very seriously, as though each one required my individual attention." Courtney did not speak. "The stones on the windowsill," he continued. "She had been collecting them for 2 weeks before." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "I could not put them away. I have tried. I cannot." "You should not have to," she said. He looked at her across the table. In the candlelight, with the careful control of his expression finally absent, he looked his age, not old, but real. A man who had been carrying something enormous for 6 years and had not, until this moment, set any part of it down. "Will you tell me about them?" she asked. "Now?" "When you are ready. There is no urgency." He was quiet for a moment, and then, Eleanor was the most patient person I have ever known. Patient in the way that good people are patient, not because they are waiting for something, but because they have decided that the present moment is sufficient. A pause. I was not like that. I was always moving toward the next thing. She used to say that I treated life like a problem to be solved. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but its memory. She was not wrong. And Rose? Rose was 2 years and 8 months old. His voice was very even. She had decided that her primary purpose in life was to determine the precise location of every stone on the estate grounds. She was thorough about it. She kept records in a little book she could not yet write in. He paused. She drew pictures of the stones instead. Very detailed pictures. She was going to be a natural philosopher, I think, if she had been given the time. Courtney felt the tears arrive before she could decide anything about them. She did not hide them. "I am sorry," she said. "I am profoundly sorry." "So am I," he said. "Every day." They sat together in the candlelight for a long time after that, not speaking. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had just been said, and everything that did not need to be. When she finally rose to retire, she paused at the door. "How did they die?" she asked, quietly, without pressure, giving him every opportunity not to answer. He was silent for so long she thought he had decided not to. Then, we had been at a dinner in the village. Eleanor did not wish to stay late. Rose had been unwell earlier in the week, and she wanted to return home before the cold set in. I said we could stay another hour. I wanted to finish a conversation about the county drainage bill. His voice did not change in inflection, which somehow made it worse. On the road back, a wheel struck a hidden rut. The carriage went over. I was thrown clear. They were not. "The county drainage bill," Courtney said softly. "The county drainage bill," he confirmed. "I have not been able to read a document about agricultural drainage since." She crossed back to the table. She did not touch him. She understood instinctively that he was not yet in a place where comfort could be received that way. She simply stood near him, present and steady, the way her grandmother had taught her to be present with suffering. "It was an accident," she said. "You know that." "I know it," he said. "I do not always feel it." "No," she said. "I imagine not." She said goodnight and left him there in the candlelight. And she understood, walking back to her room through the dark corridor, that something fundamental had changed between them. Not because of what he had told her, because of the fact that he had told her at all. He had let her in. She was not certain what to do with that. But she knew it was not nothing. He told her. After 6 years of silence, he told her. And she stayed. She did not offer false comfort or borrowed wisdom. She stayed and she listened and she let it be what it was. That, more than anything, is when it truly began. It happened in the library on a Thursday evening in November, 3 weeks after the night of the drainage bill. She was reading when he entered, moving along the shelves in the way she had come to recognize as his version of restlessness. His left hand found a spine and drummed against it. The habit she had learned meant he was circling something he had not yet found the words for. "May I ask you something?" His voice was careful in the specific way it became careful when the question mattered. "You may. Why did you stay? After the fever? After what you learned? You had every reason to consider this arrangement a cruelty and to feel nothing toward me but the desire to leave it." She set her book down. Because the evidence kept refusing to support that conclusion. She paused. "And because what you told me about Eleanor and Rose, a man who remembers his daughter's stone collection in that kind of detail, is not a cruel man. He's a grieving one. Those are different things." He turned from the shelves to face her. The candlelight was doing something to his features, softening the precision, making him look less like a man managing everything and more like a man who would very much like to stop. I had intended the arrangement as something more than transactional, he said. From the beginning, I want you to know that. Then tell me what you intended it as. He stepped toward her. She did not step back. I saw you at that reception 3 years ago. I watched you for most of an evening and I thought, there is a person who understands what it costs to hold yourself together when no one around you sees what it is costing. Another step. I recognized it because it was what I did every day. And I thought, he stopped. You thought what? I thought that if I could find a reason to be near you, perhaps I could remember what it felt like to be near someone. She looked at him. At this careful, damaged, unexpectedly honest man standing in the candlelight with his defenses finally, visibly, down. The arrangement was not accidental, he continued. I knew Crane was looking for a buyer. I put myself forward. I am not proud of how it was done. I want you to know why I did it. I think I already know, she said softly. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him. When he raised his hand to her face, slowly, giving her every moment she needed to step back, she did not move. His thumb traced her cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted everything the rest of him projected. The gesture of a man who had been careful with nothing for years, choosing deliberately to be careful with this. Because, he started and stopped. She waited. The fire crackled, the candles held. He lowered his hand. The mask returned, not slowly but all at once, a door closing. He stepped back. Forgive me. I should not have. Louie. His name in her voice, for the first time. It stopped him completely. What were you going to say? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she believed, genuinely, he might answer. Good night, Mrs. Crawford, he said, and left. She stood alone in the library with her heart entirely out of rhythm, one hand pressed to her chest, staring at the space where he had been. The half-finished sentence sat in the room like something that refused to dissolve. Because what? She did not sleep. Not from fear. From something considerably more inconvenient than fear. He started a sentence he could not finish. She used his name for the first time. And something is about to arrive that will make the question of whether they can find their way to each other feel genuinely impossible. Subscribe and stay with us. The letter arrived on a cold December morning. Courtney was already at breakfast when the butler brought it in on a silver tray. Heavy paper, red wax seal, the same crest that had appeared on her transfer documents, Crane's mark. She watched it cross the table to Louie and watched his face as he read. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened. He set the letter down with a deliberateness that told her he wanted to do something else with it entirely. Has something happened? She asked. Nothing that concerns you. The professional distance of their first weeks returned as if it had never left. She said nothing more. She watched. That night, unable to settle, she descended to the ground floor. The office door was ajar. Lamplight spilled through the gap. She heard two voices, Louie's and one she did not recognize. Oily. Careful. The particular intonation of someone delivering a threat while maintaining the legal appearance of a conversation. The terms of the contract were met, Your Grace. However, there are irregularities that have come to light. What irregularities? Louie's voice was flat as stone. The nature of the original debt. Certain values were inflated by parties who profited considerably from Mrs. Crawford's misfortune. She was transferred under fraudulent pretenses. If this became a matter of public record, the implications for your reputation. What do you want? A savoring silence. Merely to ensure all parties understand the situation, and to discuss appropriate arrangements for my continued discretion. Courtney backed away from the door before she could be heard. She stood in the dark hallway with her back against the wall and let the information settle through her like cold water. The debts had been fabricated. She had been sold on a fraud. And this man was here to use her as an instrument to extract money from Louie. She climbed the stairs with the mechanical steadiness of someone who has had the floor removed and has not yet begun to fall. In her room, she sat at the small desk and thought. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she went looking for evidence. Not to protect herself, to understand what she was standing in the middle of. The library desk, the correspondence files, the ledgers. She went through them with the focused precision of a woman who had managed a complicated household and understood how paper trails worked. She found it in the third file, a letter. From a solicitor she did not recognize, dated 4 months ago, 2 months before her transfer contract was signed, addressed to Louie. She read it 3 times. The language was careful and legal, but what it described was unmistakable. A transaction, a woman, a debt, a sum that matched, almost exactly, the total of Henry Crawford's outstanding obligations. He had known, before Crane ever called her into that office, before her name was inscribed in those spaces. Louie Pritchard had been aware of this transaction 2 months before it happened. She sat with the letter in her hands and felt everything she had been carefully building over these weeks. The herb garden, the evenings in the library, Eleanor and Rose and the stones on the windowsill, the half-finished sentence in the candlelight, all of it shift beneath her like ground that was not as solid as she had believed. Had it been real? Or had it been a man managing a woman he had purchased, ensuring she remained compliant? She set the letter back precisely where she had found it. She went to her room and packed in the dark. Her few clothes, her herb case, a letter written by lamplight with hands that were, finally, shaking. Your Grace, I will not be the instrument of your destruction, and I cannot remain in a house where I cannot determine what is true. Whatever this arrangement cost you, I release you from it. Whatever happened between us, I am choosing to believe it was real. That is the only kindness I can offer either of us. C. Crawford. Before dawn, she descended the stairs. Her footsteps on the stone sounded like a decision being made 1 step at a time. She left through the garden door. The mist took her immediately. She found a letter and she read it as evidence of betrayal. But she does not yet know what that letter actually means. The truth is on its way. It is coming on horseback down a moorland road, and it will change everything. Louie found the note at 6 in the morning. He read it once. He did not read it again. He was in his traveling coat before the thought completed itself. She had no money, no destination, no knowledge of these roads. She was on foot in December fog. She had perhaps 4 hours. He took the fastest horse and rode as if the alternative was unthinkable, because it was. He found her a mile from the estate gates, her back straight, her pace deliberate, her thin shawl no match for the morning cold, the posture of a woman who has made a decision and intends to honor it, regardless of what it costs her physically. The hoofbeats reached her before he did. He saw her slow, pause, and then, with what looked like the deliberate act of someone bracing for impact, turn around. He dismounted before the horse fully stopped and covered the distance between them in strides that had nothing measured about them. You found the letter? He said. Yes. And you read it as evidence that I arranged this, that I knew about the transaction before it happened and chose not to prevent it. The dates, the amounts. She kept her voice steady. What else was I supposed to read it as? He reached into his coat and produced a second letter. He held it out. She did not take it immediately. Please, he said. The word cost him something visible. She took it. She read it. It was from the same solicitor, dated 3 weeks after the first, a follow-up. And what it described was not a transaction. It was a refusal, Louie's refusal, documented in precise legal language to proceed with what Crane had proposed, followed by a counter-proposal that he would assume the Crawford debts in their entirety himself, without any transfer of any person, and that Crane would consider the matter closed. Crane had ignored the counter-proposal. Crane had proceeded regardless. The letter she had found was the original proposal, not the refusal. She had found the document that proved the attempt, not the one that proved he had tried to stop it. She looked up from the letter. "You tried to stop it," she said. "I tried to make it unnecessary." His voice was even in the way it became, even when things were costing him. "I failed. By the time I understood that Crane had proceeded regardless, you had already signed. I could have told you all of this from the first evening. I chose not to." "Why?" "Because I was afraid," he said. "I was afraid that if you knew how thoroughly I had failed to protect you from something I had seen coming, you would leave. And He stopped. "You what?" He looked at her across the moorland with 6 years of grief and 6 weeks of something else entirely visible in his face. "I did not want you to leave," he said. "I had not wanted anyone to stay for 6 years. And then you arrived and organized my library and grew rosemary in my garden and read Cowper aloud by the fire and asked me about Eleanor in a voice that made it possible to answer. And I found I could not." He paused. "I could not bear the idea of being the reason you went." The fog was lifting. The moorland opened around them as the light grew. "In the library," she said. 3 weeks ago. You said because, and you did not finish. What were you going to say?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I love you," he said, plainly, without theater, in the tone of a man who has been carrying a fact for some time and has finally decided to put it down somewhere. "Because you walked into a house that had been a memorial for 6 years, and within a fortnight it was something else entirely. Because you sat with me while I told you about a county drainage bill and did not offer me absolution I have not earned. Because you said their names, Eleanor, Rose, and I did not break. I thought I would break. I did not." He held her gaze. "Because you are the first person in 6 years who has made me feel that being alive is not simply a continuation of the night they died." Courtney felt the tears arrive and did not hide them. "I came to this house afraid of you," she said. "I had constructed an entire version of you, cold, calculating, the man who had purchased me, and I held on to it for weeks because it was safer than the alternative." "The alternative," he said. "That you were real," she said, "and that I was falling in love with you, which is considerably more frightening than anything Crane ever did to me." Something broke open in his face. Quiet, profound, the expression of a man who has just been given something he had stopped believing he deserved. He crossed the remaining distance between them, and when he took her face in his hands, it was with the same care she had come to know from the garden, from the fire, from the deliberate and considered way he did everything that mattered. "I should like to try," he said, "if you will allow it. I cannot promise I will be easy. I have been alone too long, and I have forgotten how to do a great many things, but I should like to try." "So should I," she said. When he kissed her, it was not urgent or desperate. It was the kiss of 2 people who have finally arrived somewhere they have been traveling toward for a long time and intend to stay. Around them the fog continued to lift. The moor turned gold in the early light. After a moment, she stepped back and looked up at him. "We have work to do," she said. "Crane needs to be stopped, not just for me. For every woman who sat in that office with her name already written in the spaces." "Together," he said. She took his arm. They turned back toward Thornvick. The estate rose from the morning mist as they approached. The same gray stone, the same narrow windows. But it looked different now. Or perhaps she looked at it differently. Perhaps that was the same thing. She told him she was falling in love with him. He told her she was the first reason he had found to be alive. Subscribe if this story is making you feel something real, and share it with someone who needs to believe that love after loss is possible. They built the case over 6 weeks. Louie's solicitors had been assembling evidence for months: forged documents, diverted funds, a paper trail constituting a complete record of a man who had made a career of engineering, the ruin of vulnerable people, and profiting from their desperation. What Courtney added was what no solicitor could provide: testimony. The lived experience of sitting in that office with her name already written before she arrived. The knowledge of the clerk at the front desk who had spoken too freely once and, when approached carefully and given protection, was willing to speak carefully and precisely. She wrote letters. She made inquiries through channels she had not known she possessed until she began pulling on threads. 3 women came forward within the first week, then 2 more. Then a family whose circumstances bore the unmistakable signature of Crane's particular method: debts that multiplied after a husband's death, a solicitor who appeared with documents already prepared, a choice that was not a choice presented as the only available option. None of them had known the others existed. None of them had known that what had happened to them had a pattern, and a name, and a man behind it who could be made to answer for it. The case was presented to the magistrate on a clear February morning. Louie sat beside Courtney at the table, his shoulder near hers, present and steady. She testified for 40 minutes. She spoke about the office, the document, the name already inscribed, the choice that was not a choice. She described the clerk's lowered voice. She described Crane's expression when she told him she had left accounts with 3 people, that single flicker in his certainty, and what it had told her about a man who believed he was untouchable. "He did not see me as a person," she said. "He saw me as a figure in a ledger. That is not a transaction. That is theft. And the women in this room with me today were stolen from in exactly the same way, by the same man, using the same method. What he built his fortune on was not business acumen. It was the calculated exploitation of people who had been made to believe they had no other choice." The other women testified after her, each account different in its particulars, identical in its architecture. Crane sat through all of it with the rigid composure of a man who had decided composure was his best remaining asset. When the testimonies mounted beyond what composure could absorb, he interrupted twice. The magistrate silenced him both times with increasing firmness. The verdict came the following afternoon: guilty on all counts, transportation for life. His entire fortune seized and distributed among his victims. The courtroom erupted. Courtney sat very still in the noise of it and felt Louie's hand find hers beneath the table. She held it and did not let go. Crane was led out in restraints, past the women whose lives he had treated as instruments. He did not look at any of them. That was, she thought, the most revealing thing of all. Even now he could not bring himself to see them. She saw them. She had seen every one of them. Outside in the thin February sunlight, the women gathered briefly, not with ceremony, but with the ease of people who have shared something that cannot be explained to anyone who was not there. "What happens now?" one of them asked. "Now," Courtney said, "we go home." Justice came because she refused to disappear. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe. Every week we tell stories about people who refuse to accept the version of themselves the world tried to impose on them. They married on a morning in April, not in a cathedral, in the village church at the edge of the Thornvick estate, with the doors open to the spring air and the community gathered and no ambiguity whatsoever about what this was. Louie had asked the week before, sitting beside her in the library, quietly, without performance. "I want you to choose me in front of people," he said, freely, with full knowledge of everything you know about me. "I already have," she said, "but yes." Courtney wore ivory silk embroidered with herbs from the garden she had restored, rosemary, thyme, sage, worked into the fabric by her own hands over the winter evenings. Louie wore the expression of a man who has been given something he is not entirely sure he deserves, and has decided the only adequate response is to spend the rest of his life deserving it. Mrs. Pemberton cried. She denied it afterward to anyone who asked. When they exchanged their vows, every word was chosen. There was no contract behind these ones, no designated spaces, only two people who had arrived in each other's lives through the worst possible circumstances and had found, in the process of surviving those circumstances together, that they could not imagine arriving anywhere without the other. The black cloth came down from the portrait on the stairs that same evening. Eleanor looked out at the entrance hall with her quality of patient stillness, her husband's eyes, her daughter's calm. Beside her, Rose was frozen in the act of reaching for something outside the frame, caught in a laugh aimed at something only she could see. Courtney stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up at them for a long time. Louie stood beside her. "Hello," she said quietly. He took her hand. "She would have liked you," he said. "Eleanor. She had very little patience for people who were not honest. She would have found you a considerable relief." And Rose? A pause, a real one, full of something warm. "Rose would have brought you stones," he said, one at a time, very seriously. Courtney laughed, a real one, unguarded, filling the entrance hall with a sound it had not heard in a long time. Thornvick changed in the months that followed. Windows that had been sealed for years opened to the spring air. The music room was unlocked. Louie played on evenings when the mood allowed, and the music moved through rooms that had been silent for 6 years, and the house seemed to remember what it had been built for. The conservatory continued its defiant vitality, tended now openly. In the afternoons, sometimes with Louie reading in the chair she had dragged in from the corridor. The child's room at the end of the east corridor remained as it was. Courtney tended it as Louie had, regularly with care, keeping the stones on the windowsill exactly where Rose had placed them. They did not speak about it often. They did not need to. On a spring evening, sitting together in the library, she asked him the question she had been saving. "What did you actually think?" she said, "the first time you saw me at that reception? The real answer." He considered it with the seriousness he gave everything. That you were performing composure at considerable personal cost, and that whoever had made it necessary for you to perform it had done you a significant injury. "That is not remotely romantic," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it was true." "I thought you could see through everything I was doing," she said. "It frightened me half to death." "Good," he said. "You frightened me considerably more. I had not been frightened of anything in 6 years. It was deeply inconvenient." She looked at him, at this careful, honest, finally open man sitting beside her in the warm library with soil-stained fingernails and a glass of wine, and the expression of a person who has stopped bracing for loss and started cautiously to expect something else. "Are you happy?" she asked. He thought about it, genuinely considered it, the way he considered everything. "Yes," he said, "I am." A pause. I had forgotten what it felt like to be able to say that and mean it. She leaned against him. Outside, the April gardens were alive with the insistence of things that have survived winter and decided to make something of it. Inside, 2 people who had both lost everything, one to debt and disappointment, one to a rut in a road on a February night, had found in the wreckage of those losses the thing neither of them had known to look for. Not rescue, not redemption, not the erasure of everything that had come before. Just this, chosen clearly by both of them, every day, which turned out to be more than enough. 2 widows, one secret kept too long, and the love that grew in the space between grief and honesty. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, and tell me in the comments which moment changed everything for you. I read every single one,